Good evening, everyone. As I am very delighted to be introducing tonight's event as a co-organizer of Worldviews. This particular panel dealing with the notion of the political body, gender, and race really is one that brings to light some of those fractures and disalignments and conflicts that really we need to engage with when thinking of processes of world making. And the notion of the political body is something, the reason why we felt really strongly about dedicating an entire panel to it is that it's one of those phrases used so ubiquitously since kind of earliest configurations, kind of pigeonholing Latin American art, for example, within the framework of ideological conceptualism. But it's one of those containers, those operative concepts that really has changed, especially today when we're thinking about the social body, how the body undergoes processes of healing through art and things like this. So to be brief, this wonderful panel is chaired by Cecilia Fajardo-Gil, who is going to be sharing the conversation that it will follow the keynote by the wonderful Lili Schwartz, who you will be able to see shortly. To give you a quick introduction to the both of them, Cecilia is a British Venezuelan art historian and curator. Currently, she's joining us from the Clark Institute, where she is a fellow. And she's also working on forthcoming exhibitions, Chican AOX Body. The edited volume Remains Tomorrow, Themes in Contemporary Latin American Abstraction, as well as another volume on 20th and 21st century Guatemalan art. And though I won't mention her multiple curatorial projects, I will mention one, which was the groundbreaking show Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960-1985, which was curated with Andrea Junta, which traveled from the Hammer Museum to the Brooklyn Museum to the Pinacoteca de Sao Paulo, and where, once again, this show was able to shed further light on what the political body is and how we can think about it, how it helps us understand and peel away deeper layers of meaning. In the panel today, we will be hearing the voices of Sebastian Eduardo Davila, Gabriella Jerome, Dora Lungo Bahia, Miguel Lopez, Guillermo Conges, Guadalupe Maravilla, who sadly is not going to be with us today, but you can also watch his contribution online, and Cecilia Vicuña. They will be further introduced by Cecilia later on. And finally, I get to introduce Lilia Moritz-Schwartz, who is our keynote this evening. She is a professor in anthropology at the University of Sao Paulo and a global scholar and visiting professor at Princeton. She has held fellowships in universities internationally, and she has published a multitude of essential books in English and Portuguese. Just this year, two of them, one titled About Authoritarianism and the other, The Black Encyclopedia. She has curated many exhibitions, including Black Encyclopedia at the Pinacoteca do Estado de Sao Paulo this year. And since 2015, she has worked as a co-curator at the MASP for the Histories series. So without further ado, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Please put your questions in the chat box at any point during the event. These will be then funneled through to Cecilia so that they can be incorporated in the conversation. And don't forget that translation is available by clicking on the globe in the lower right of your screens. And it is in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. The majority of the event this evening will be in either Spanish or Portuguese. Thank you so much. And Lili, welcome. Please take the stage and see you later.
Thank you. Muito obrigada. Boa tarde aqui onde eu estou a todas.
Thank you. Good afternoon from where I'm standing. I am very honored to have been invited by Cecilia Fajardo-Gil to be part of the political bodies Gender and Race, to be discussing these issues here today, this panel on Latin American art and the decolonial turn. I'll be sharing my screen. Can you all see it? Let me share that with you. Bear with me for a second. You can all see it, right? Just give me a thumbs up whether you can see the screen. All right. The first part of my presentation deals with a coincidence of collections in the US and Brazil, or a false coincidence. These are two identical paintings that come up in two separate contexts, and they do not refer. One is by Theodore Kaufman, On to Liberty, 1867. It belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Oil on Wood by François Auguste Biard, Fuga de Escravos, Slaves on the Run, 1859. The Sergio Fadel collection. There's more than a coincidence. They're almost identical. They describe a matriarchal family, moms, children. Two have been painted by white, European, male abolitionists to express what true was and abolition was. Two were foreigners when they painted these two pictures. The German painter, Theodor Kaufmann, thought that the natural route for slaves on the run would be to run to the north, to the free north. The French painter, François Biard, thought about a different landscape. The enslaved people would be living the fields and would be roaming throughout the country. These images are a good pretext to discuss how these conventional visualizations moved around the country, planning, philosophies, abolitionism, political bodies, conventions, and genders. Secondly, the fact that these are colonial productions exhibited in museums and collections lead us to believe that these images could be analyzed from a different perspective, comparing traumas from the past and from the present, and what I call the past of the present. Thirdly, the enslaved women are not seen as victims. However, their bodies carry heavy loads that they had always carried in the past, and they would continue to do so into the present. So history is not what changes, but what reiterates, what can be associated with and becomes natural. However, more than survivors, these images project one type of survival into the future. These are symptom images. And the second portion will be discussing more recent productions. They review that image of that heavy load, and in place of that, turbans. My objective is to move from the past into the present, counter-analyzing history according to Waldemar Benjamin, a reverse history on the terms of Ayala Azulay, pointing out the absence of the presence. And this On to Liberty, it's an important piece of the visual memory of the USA after the Civil War. This painting shows that women, when they walk out of a dark forest, they look at a star with hope in their eyes and a flag as their objective. You can interpret this is a escape of enslaved people through to a Union camp for freedom. The fact that they're carrying heavy loads represented to slaves on the run, or fugitive slaves, reiterate that image. Conflict is briefly mentioned with the smoke because the future was uncertain, however promising. That painting is exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in a gallery dedicated to the American Civil War. In his story and the pictography of Civil War, the fugue or the escape of enslaved people is in a recurrent picture. Some men bore arms, and they were called counterband. With the advance of conflict in the Confederate land, the women and children left behind felt that they had to join the Union troops for support. That is a possible explanation for the absence of males in this picture. You can see also collective scapes. This painting is from 1867. In the foreground, you see 4 women and 8 children at different ages. Women have branches. They try to maintain the discipline of the younger children using those sticks. These branches are symbols of life and growth also. That is the case of this representation. 3 carry very similar packs. In the back, you see another woman with 2 other groups, with 2 other children, and that gives us direction as to the leader of the group towards the Union flag. The group is represented in very distinct colors. Rough clothes made out of cotton. The brighter colors are only in those bundles of cloth, of clothes they're carrying, and their necklaces. The 2 women in the center show their chest and shoulders and their skirts. The woman on the far left wears a longer skirt covering all the way to the foot or to the feet, and an open skirt. It's a symptomatic image. The 4 children lead the pack. It's curious, humorous to a certain extent. The older one dragged the younger ones. That's the only one that is wearing heavy boots that do not make sense or do not match the rest of their clothes. So that makes the fact that the others are bare feet stand out. So the other one is connecting the 2 things, back to the forest or to one of the women looking for support. A group of boys sets that boundary, that transition into freedom, and there's no turning back. The women wear clothes that are very peculiar. These are some projections to the indigenous peoples' clothing, such as the universal native, a colonial representation that bears intersections and social markers that separates race, gender, and generation. They are indigenous in the way they wear their clothes and Black in the color of their skin. The group seems to be painted from the background with the very detailed contours of their faces, reflecting their academic education. Kaufman was a Civil War soldier. He gets to the United States exiled in 1850 after being a partisan in the Dresden barricades. His career as a soldier follow a similar path. A third of these German soldiers served in the Civil War on the side of the Unionists against slavery, translating their ideals of freedom. The first record of Kaufman, US, is given by the National Academy of Design, 1851, 54, and 56. In 1855, he opens a painting school in his atelier in New York, but he has to close it down, and he becomes a portrait painter and a photography support person, and he had on and off jobs. But this scenery must be derived from his own experience when he was a soldier on the Union side, or inspired by the underground Scapes. We can't tell. Between 1860 and 1870, he was in Washington, and he died in poverty in New York in 1896. The culture of the escape of slaves does not have any record. That's an exhibit in Germany in 1868, when Kaufman exhibited 8 paintings. Those reviews point out On to Liberty and the Pacific Railway train. The first one, the fate of enslaved African peoples and the detrimental effects of the conquest of the West. Both are seen academically, and this illustrates a construction of the otherness.
The paintings were not sold, and he goes back to the US with both paintings. Maybe the uncertainty of his context during the Reconstruction era may have created bad reception. The painting was not sold and would allegedly be at the property of his family up until 1943, and only in the 1970s this painting comes back to the scene, exposed in a particular gallery in New York. First, we see the anecdotal dynamics of the scene and the sexualization of the characters. Children are being pushed towards liberty. In his book on art history in the 19th century, Franz Paul says that this scene is dramatic, but different from the way women are usually represented, with few clothes. The authors of The Image of the Black in Western Art highlighted the fact that the fugitives were barefoot and that they were emerging from the forest. They also found the women's expression to be odd. They resemble more like refugees driven from their homes rather than of slaves hopefully setting out for a new life of freedom. The chest and shoulders may be seen as an exoticizing and eroticizing process. Eugène Delacroix in Liberty Leading the People in 1830 would be a great example of that. There's a reason for that. When we look at these paintings made in the US, when Kaufman painted this painting, the enslaved peoples or recently freed black people is quite different. Women are always seen with their bodies covered, showing very little skin. This type of indigenous standard is what we also see in Kaufman's painting. But maybe they found it odd because of a different social reality, because of this painting that was made in Brazil by Franz August Biard. This is a very well-known painting, and here the treatment to the painting seems to be a study. Here we see women and children living in the forest, and they walk towards a campsite. We can see the sunset, but we don't see any flag. We can see the orange colors that portray the sun. We can also see the grass and the floor that seem to represent a different reality. Three women who do not have children are carrying this bundle of clothes on their heads. The group of children ahead is once again led by the child that looks the oldest. Once again, everyone is barefoot except one child, the same child we saw in Kaufman's painting. This child is being dragged. Women's clothes are also different. The fabric is a bit rougher. We can see that they're not that fancy. The lack of finishing lines in the painting still allows us to see the details in the characters' faces. However, the painting standard in different pictures are different, but the scene composition is identical. In the Brazilian painting, we do not see the second group of people. We don't see the North American flag either. And on the left-hand side, the woman is cut by the fixture, but they're very similar. Biard's painting may be the origin of these odd elements that were pointed out by the critics in North America. Biard was a painter, drawer. He was born in Lyon, the same city where he learned how to paint by Pierre-Henri Rivel. He became the official painter in court of King Louis Philippe up until the downfall of monarchy in 1848. Biard was known by the way he personally used gender pictures, using an anecdotal perspective, always comical. Even when he used the historical genre, he mixed these dynamics. Besides that, he was known by his travel records to exotic places and his paintings on slavery. These reports, such as this painting, were presented in the Paris Salon in 1835. In this scene, he represents enslaved people being sold. He used an Eastern take to these types and costumes. Black people are suffering. We can see them on the floor, suffering from these cruelties. White men are fully armed, showing their strength on top of these enslaved people. At the same time, he explores the exotic theme. This is also a way to report these souls that are being sold. But we see that this is a colonial scenario because enslaved people are victimized and do not react. In 1840, the painter sends this painting to the Royal Academy of London, when they also received an international convention anti-slavery. This coincidence, which was calculated or not, leveraged Biard's fame. He started being identified as a painter that was engaged in the abolitionist cause. His success allowed him to come up with his first work after the Second French Republic was published. When Louis Philippe and the monarchy ended, the end of slavery was established on March the 4th the same year. Biard pays homage to that in this painting, Proclamation de la Liberté, which was exposed in the Salon in 1849 and was acquired by the government to be an addition to the Galerie Historique du Musée Château de Versailles, where it is currently located. The big painting is now an allegory of this slave liberation, crossing seas and transatlantic scenarios. We see a colonial conciliation on the painting. The image of the chains or the shackles that break and the respectful attitude towards the previously enslaved people can be seen. The image of the orderly abolition without any kind of hurdles that can be seen as an exemplary process. And one character kneels down to thank the other for having received liberty. Despite this, Biard's career goes downhill from the mid 850s on. He starts traveling to increase his repertoire of landscapes he can paint. So he shuts down his workshop in Paris and he travels to Rio de Janeiro, where he arrives on May the 6th, 1858, which was the capital of the Brazilian Empire, and that's where monarchs were located. He was welcomed by Emperor Dom Pedro II, who appreciated the arts and who welcomed BR inside the palace. In court, he painted many portraits of the imperial family, and he also got many orders from the local elite. He also worked as a painting professor. Actually, he refused this invite by a formal letter. The urban scenes of Rio de Janeiro, with the contrasts created by the large number of slaves walking around the city, was something that had already been portrayed by different painters who had arrived to Brazil before him. Rugendas, the first painter to exhibit Brazilian images in the Salon de Paris in 1827, and Debré, author to the Pittoresque Voyage and Brazilian History, published in France between 1834 and 1839. Biard started traveling around Brazil. He was particularly situated in the Amazon region, which inspired him to write a book in 1862 entitled 2 Years in Brazil, which was printed out with 180 pictures. This satire take Biard has can be seen in this book, which made the Brazilian elite feel uncomfortable. According to them, this book contributed towards a bad image of Brazil in Europe, with embarrassing descriptions of the Brazilian court and its, quote, native populations, which includes black populations and indigenous peoples, as if they were one single thing. His stay in Brazil would allow him to create rich materials and many satire texts. The painter represented indigenous peoples and black people very similarly. He would also associate to that the way black people walk. According to him, they would customarily carry a bundle of clothes on top of their heads. This was heavy load. These images scattered around France and showed people the Brazilian habit of going barefoot and women's habits of using extravagant clothes with their chest and sometimes their breasts being shown. The braid described the fabrics and all of the clothes used by black people. This was also what foreign painters would paint to represent Brazil. He spent a long time in the state of Pará, and that's when he paints slaves on the run. That's when he painted using paint and paper. It's noteworthy how ethnically diverse these women are. You see different shades of brown for their skins. The type of clothes they use and their behavior can also be compared to Rugenda's paintings or to the Braid's pictures, which are part of the same context.
Eram as mulheres africanas que dominavam a
In the
cena.
city streets, African women dominated the scene. No European artist could or wanted to escape from that. Women have always been represented carrying heavy weights on their heads. In November 1859, the painter goes to the US and he leaves a letter to his editor.
deveria durar 25
This
dias.
trip was supposed to last 25 days. He stayed here for 2 months, and he arrives in New York on January the 7th, 1860. In 61, he goes back to France, where he showed 8 large pictures with an American theme. He presented those, he exhibited those in the Paris Salon in 1861. He showed 3 abolitionist images.
Que se chamavam a ida de escravizados no navio negreiros, a venda de escravos
We
na
saw
América,
slaves going
caça dos escravos.
to the ships, slaves sent to America, and
Uma segunda tela
slaves on the run.
Unidos,
The last one
que se chama Comentários à Viagem da América do Norte.
was called Comments on My Trip to North America. So the different Americas shown by Biaf to the French were seen and were marked by savagery of indigenous and black bodies. Biard gets to New York in 1860, and he arrives at the same city Kaufman lived. He took his paintings with him, and as Luis Gonzaga Duque would say, nothing was left in the country. So we can suppose that the Slaves on the Run painting was taken by him when he traveled to the US. He was also interested in taking this type of painting to the US, and therefore one could assume that he would stop carrying out some studies on Black and indigenous peoples when he traveled to New York. Kaufman did not create formal innovations. For him, the composition or the image conception should be subordinate to the effects of the color, which is the art of painting, and the history that should be told by the painting itself. His interest as a painter was to make art a tool towards critical thinking. That is why his paintings look like they look now. We can't say that these two painters met, but this is a very likely assumption. These are two European artists in America that surely had common interests. But that doesn't matter. What I mean to say, so that I can get to my final remarks, is that these images circulated. These images circulated. The collections and colonial files are full of silence. Silence towards bodies that are represented by the others and that are always seen under the concept of otherness. And that does not focus on the sameness. Whiteness represents itself as a transparent color. It's the norm that doesn't need to be named. Slaves running from this patriarchy society implies two different forms of imprisonment. They're running away from this colonial racist structure that is not limited to the past. It is the past of the present. Abolitionism that brought together Kaufman and Biard allowed and supported this type of escape. Their society was the final destination of these bodies that were on the run, but the subjectivity of these male painters is shown in the details. Kaufman shows women which are black and exotic. Biard shows erotic black women, but they're not close to them. They're distant from them. These are savage bodies. However, we see that men run away by themselves. Women run away with their families. Glenn Lingan, contemporary artist, explores these themes in his work. Things such as language, race, identity, and desire are created on top of visual updates on slave runs propaganda, which were seen as natural by newspapers in the 1800s. They usually described their own personality, and therefore they would include Black subjectivity to the colonial work that was created. Now, I want to mix different spaces and geographies to show the way through which colonial representation of Black women has always explored them by carrying heavy weight on top of their heads or carrying with their arms, shoulders, and heads. This image was changed into an effective presence of these women that were represented by Black painters. Heitor dos Prazeres, part of the samba community in Rio, and Estacio represents this group of people, most of them women, Black women who are proudly carrying this weight. Benny Andrews shows this family of immigrants getting to Harlem, carrying suitcases, packages, and bundles of clothes. It's the same image that now represents freedom, abolition, and a new life. William Johnson in Farewell explores the escape theme, but under a different context. He shows the smoke of the train in the background, and we can see a Black family, which is very well dressed, a mother and two children looking towards the future. Cara Walker, with this famous silhouette, shows agency and insurrection in the North American scenario. The woman is being represented not as a victim, but as someone who's leading the revolution. Let's look at the turban. It's not a submission element. It's not about carrying this bundle passively. This is a symbol. I got 2 minutes, Sophia. I'll be done in 2 minutes. Dalton Pala, in his series Former Votes, shows a woman with her turban. She's healing, she's taking care, caring about the colonial past and towards the former slave system trauma. Alguidares also shows that the turban is all about knowledge and other forms and ancestral philosophy. This is a political body, a body by women that offer healing to the patient. It's about taking care and strengthening these salvation networks. I've got many other images of indigenous peoples that show women the same way. I won't have time to talk about the last exhibit Sophia mentioned, which is about the turban that is often represented in the image of these women who are not submissive, but women who are leading her own freedom processes. Since I'm out of time, I hereby conclude with one final image. The image is undated and unauthored. We know that this beautiful model is only a person from Bahia, but we can give her what she deserves, a critical perspective. Maybe she was the member of a rich community. She's now posing to this portrait. She uses beautiful Western clothes, but maybe she was part of a counter history, not in the sense of an opposition, but maybe another history, maybe a history within history that is usually written with capital letter, and it's usually European, sometimes North American. Maybe this can be changed into another type of history, a fictional history. Maybe that's when we can tell a history within the history, a history of dissidence, where enslaved people running away is an act of protection, healing, and salvation within larger social networks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Please, everyone join with your cameras. And I will see you in a moment.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Yo soy la chair de esta sesión.
I am
Voy a hablar
the chair of this session.
La mayoría vamos a hablar en español,
I will be
pero
speaking
algunos
Spanish. Most of us will.
van a hablar en portugués, así que les
We have
recomiendo que coloquen
some of our speakers who will speak in Portuguese, so please activate the translation if you may, please.
Bueno, voy a presentar muy rápidamente.
Okay, I'm going to quickly present all the participants of this roundtable. Thank you, Lily, for your keynote. I think it was very interesting. I mean, it's so great to see this colonial semiotic and this representation that is so stereotypical of Black and Indigenous bodies. And this is very complex. I don't understand why there's a political body, but well, first of all, I want to talk about Sebastian Eduardo Davila. I hope that you were able to see all of the videos. He was born in Guatemala, and he also lived in Berlin and Ciudad de Mexico, and his PhD project is the Decolonial Turn in Contemporary Art Practices and Terminology in Postwar Guatemala. And then we have Gabriella Jerome. She's a visiting lecturer in contemporary art history at the University of South Florida. She specializes in contemporary Andean art, and her research addresses issues such as indigenous agency, decoloniality, identity politics, etc. And then Dora Longo Bahia, who was born in Sao Paulo. She is a multimedia artist, and she works with painting, photography, video, performance art. She has also played the bass guitar in several experimental music bands. She has a PhD and a master in visual arts, and she's also a professor at the University of Sao Paulo. We have then Miguel Lopez, who was born in Lima, Peru. He's a writer, researcher, and curator. He investigates collaborative dynamics and feminist rearticulations of art and culture. And he has also been the curator of a lot of important projects, such as a Cecilia Vicuña work from 2019. Then we have Guillermo Conges. He is from Brazil. He has a PhD in sociology and anthropology from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and then a postdoctoral fellow from the State University of Ceará. And his research interest brings into dialogue the sociology of art, the sociology of culture, and the theories of ethnic racial relations. Guadalupe Maravilla, unfortunately, is not here, but I hope that you can see her video. And Cecilia Vicuña, artist, poet. I'm so glad that she's here. She created the concept of precarious art in Chile in '66. And she's been working and exhibiting since the 60s. And her improvisatory participatory performances emphasize indigenous cultural memory and also the collective nature of action and creativity to be able to bring forth justice, balance, and world transformation. So therefore, in order to be able to have a conversation with all of you, I'd like to first introduce the topic, political bodies. And the idea is that political bodies are usually, well, that's what we're going to debate actually, but it's usually trying to end with oppression. And we also think about race, gender, class, etc.
And we have to understand, we all understand that art is political, even the most apolitical art is political. And the political body is something different as seen from art. It's a critical expression resistant from the body, an active body that seeks for emancipation from society. It's multiple, it's specific, different sexualities that questions history, present, and future, and resists the plurality of the coloniality of the past and the future, the control of the body, the imagination, and reality. So my first question is a general question, and it has to do with the artistic practice. I love it that in our panel we have three artists, Dora Longo Bahia, and Guadalupe and Cecilia, that besides an artist, she's also a poet, because it's also very important to recognize that at the center of our discussions, we have resistance and the resilience. Most of the works that are presented in this session propose examples of what we call embodiment. It's not very well translated in Spanish, this word, but it is thought and created from a decolonial perspective, a rebellious one, of a disobedient body that functions at different levels, not only the aesthetic level. Isabel Ruiz's body works, like Sebastian says, is an installation that works as a work of art, and it's also a mourning place. Khalil proposes an ancestral sound of kit, 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 that is a memory and a rite of passage. In the performative poetry of Cecilia Vicuña, the poetry pushes and opens language, and language is how we conceive the world, and also the imagination and the existence of the body, besides the conventions and the colonial conventions of society. This makes language and existence be affirmed as feminine and within pleasure. In the case of Guadalupe Malabilia, I hope you can check her work. She talks about, or he talks about, the position of a curating artist as a migrant. This is a migrant status that is continuous. She registers this in sculptures and head dressings. Dora Longo Bahia, in her video, introduces the notion, this would be an antithesis of body politics, or the idea of body politics. That is what makes up the church, the state, the social rules, etc., everything that regulates racism. And in this case, Dora goes through time like Lily does, where she goes first in the civilizatory status of Western culture that colonized us through the patriarchal dominion with its power on the feminine body and exerts a violence, even the raping. The Dora's work, I know that is very controversial, but it should be, because colonialism is extremely controversial. It is the most political, the most violent, and it exists, it is active. And this is what Guillermo speaks in her presentation, like Ventura Profana, who is a transvestite artist, with Primera Misa, or First Mass, where the body is shown as vulnerable. It is a violence against her. Then we have Violista Quispe, Gaudencia Yupari, and Venuka Ivanan. Also, the use of the figurative style of the Sarwana peoples, promoting feminism and protesting against the violence of gender. The aesthetics is like a politics, and the body is always mediating. And then we have Giuseppe Campusane that proposes this erotic relation with knowledge, the idea of founding a new nation for an androgynous, indigenous, transvestite body that does not find itself in a misogynist story. This is, we are in a misogynist history. We have these representations that are generic, colonialist, as Lilia just showed, as indigenous bodies, as bodies that don't want to be colonized. This is the starting point of the political body. So the question really is, if you could somehow expose a little bit more about this multiple function, this multiple role, this concept of art that is seen beyond the limits of what is called the institutional institution, the artistic institution, and within this, the role of imagination, to be able to imagine a reality that is not victimized, not colonized. It is somehow the big push, I would say. I don't know if we want to start in alphabetical order. Dora, would you like to start? Well, first
of all, I would like to
Prim-
thank you. Thank you, Cecilia, for having me. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sophia. I'm very happy to be here. I've seen and heard many nice things. And I'm happy that despite of being controversial, my video is still out there on the air. I haven't heard any flack, at least. I'll be speaking in Portuguese. So there are some issues that cannot be easily translated. Let me say something about what Cecilia said about embodiment. I always think about embodiment. I think incorporation in Portuguese, incorporação. It's something spiritual, something that about the body, but that goes beyond your physical body. The body, the way I see it, is what is a work of art, something that can be incorporated. Cecilia mentioned something that is very important, the way I see it. The fact that it's multiple, it's a multiplicity. And that characteristic of a artwork, it's subversive. It has, or it carries that power to shake institutions, even the institution of art. Just by carrying the name, art is an institution. And that creates a new field. Politics is becoming more and more economics. And the role of the sensitive, what is multiple, that's the role to be played by art, not art institution, art as a de-institution, if I may.
Quería darle la prioridad a las artistas.
I wanted to give the priority to the artists first. Cecilia, would you like to give us your perspective, please? Well, I was going to be listening only. I didn't want to be a listener, maybe just a speaker, just a listener. But okay, I'm very happy to be here listening to all of you. And as to what you have just said in terms of embodiment, Dora said, I'm sorry, my Portuñol is not very good. Do you speak Portuñol, Cecilia? I'm listening to the simultaneous. So she said that she liked the word incorporación, embodiment, incorporación, or corporalidad for embodiment as a translation. This is very interesting because before the present time, we said encarnar rather than embody. Embody would be translated as encarnar. And I love this word, encarnar, because the flesh means death. It means decomposing. It's a state, not a matter. Of course, nobody likes this because when we use the word encarnar, it immediately associates to the religious and the Christian meaning. But it's a pity to lose this word encarnar in the sense of flesh, or carnaval, carnival. Carnival refers to the flesh that will be lost. So I think that right now, the sense of death is what we all have in our minds. The human culture has been condemned, and it is condemned to suffering. And this is how we treat our bodies. This is what I would have to say. Thank you, Cecilia. Gabriela? Well, first of all, thank you very much, Cecilia, for organizing this panel, and also Michael and Sophia. And I would also like to thank Venuka Banan and Violeta Quispe for sharing all her comments with me, which helped me a great deal to make my presentations. And I think they are listening to me right now. As to the question that Cecilia posed, I was thinking about this role of the imagination and what arts allows us to do, because although Violeta and Venuka are talking about facts that occur to women, not only in Peru, not only to the Sarwin women, but around the world, all of this abuse of women and not recognizing equality of women. Also, the works of art allow them to imagine other futures. Especially, I thought of Venuka's work called Barayuk, and here she represents Sarwinian women holding Sarwin or sticks that was only allowed for men to do. So through her work, she empowers women, and she shows that by holding these sticks, they also demand the participation of women in the politics of the community. And also in the case of Violeta, she represents an equico, that is an object that also represents the male figure. It's like a luck charm, and she represented as a woman, something that does not exist, but it is her way of changing her future through these representations, these artistic representations, and imagine other types of situations for women.
And something that I found very interesting, and I contrasted that with what was mentioned by Lilia in her presentation, which was so interesting. And it's this whole thing about the outfit and how that gives meaning to bodies, and how below those colonial views, and we can represent groups with outfit that makes them otherness, and a homogeneous group like the Black homogeneity represented in just a very homogeneous way. But when it's somebody that's talking about their own collective, like Violeta and Benuca, they use outfits, clothing that represents them, that identifies them with their people. And that's two things that I wanted to mention.
Lily, sorry. Lily, would you like to?
Eu vou ser breve, porque já falei muito. Eu vou aproveitar para fazer o que eu não fiz, que é
Yes,
agradecer.
I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank you for putting together this wonderful group of people. I really liked all of the presentations, and I think they really make sense considering what Cecilia mentioned, which is the concept of a political body. This group of artists and this group of researchers really show this idea. I love it when Mario Pedrosa says that in times of crisis, what we need is to be close to artists. I tried to show different ways, through which artists portray freedom, emerging entities, and these insurgent bodies, and that therefore make this history be created inside out. It's a counter history somehow. I really liked the discussion on how to translate the concept of embodiment. Dora translated embodiment as incorporation, because for us in Brazil, when we incorporate something, well, that is something that is done in African religion rituals. That's when they incorporate or embody other spirits. I liked the other idea from Cecilia of incarnating or incarnation. She talked about the relation of this concept with the word carne, which would be flesh in Portuguese. And this connection with carnival. These societies have sexism and patriarchy in common, as Miguel said. I mean, that was a brief comment because I used too much of my time. Thank you very much.
Guillermo, ¿quieres hablar?
Guillermo, would you like to say something?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for accepting my work. I'm super excited. I was listening to you. I was just, thinking to myself. And when you called my name, I was really distracted. I really liked all of the presentations. This idea of a political body, according to my research, which has been developed with Brazilian artists, these are Black Brazilian people who are active in the Brazilian scenario. Well, I think about these bodies as political bodies, but bodies that fight colonial standards, that fight sexism, misogyny. These bodies are always fighting the rules of a legacy world, a legacy that we got after the colonial expansion. Denise Ferreira da Silva is an author that talks about that. So I'm thinking about how to open new portals, new doors, other possibilities of inventing these concepts. These are bodies and people that are fighting. These people understand their bodies and they know that Black people, women, indigenous peoples, and other communities have been erased from the Brazilian art history. These people were not acknowledged, they were not legitimized, they were not consecrated in the Brazilian art history. These people are now revisiting these histories. They're revisiting the past of art history, of our history, and they're rethinking the past and the present. So they're fighting that was, and they're fighting that of what will be. But they're also looking forward. They're considering new ways of existing. And that's it. Thank you.
Sebastián.
Sorry, Sebastian and then Miguel. I'm going to add a question later so that we can continue. Thank you so much for everything that you're sharing with us and for this time that we're sharing together, right? I think that with our answers, we're answering what a political body is. I think that this is a term that has a history. It comes from somewhere, it comes from a thought, but we're also adding to it. And from what was said, I wanted to mention some parts, which can connect to what I did in the video and to what I think as well. Imagination, right? You asked about imagination, matter, and I really liked what Cecilia Vicuña said. I really have to think about that, because you said that flesh is state, not matter. And I mean, I really have to think about that. I thought that was very intriguing, to be honest. And the political body, of course, and life. I mean, right now we were talking about life. We heard about life. So I wanted to just think about those words. And I'm here thinking about certain practices that I try to get closer to, and I try to generate a sensitive language about they don't represent body, and that's another word that we mentioned. They don't represent body in a naturalistic way, for example, from a drawing, let's say, but it's through the use of materiality and matter, especially of the earth, burnt earth, but also wet soil, for example, burnt soil. And they refer to a story and bodies that have been violated, but they're also bodies in transformation. And I see a little bit of the potential, not necessarily of imagining something, but of doing something. And I think that Isabel Ruiz, when she was exhibited in the 90s, and the intervention of Kalel, the Kit series, I mean, those were spaces that I imagine, right? Because that's what we do when we imagine. The people who imagine, that's what we do. And there was this relationship between the living and the dead. And that wasn't shown as in a naturalistic way. It was activated through the transformation of matter and materiality. So I think that that's a little bit what I was thinking in terms of political body. And I really liked this idea of the political body. On one hand, politics of the body and transform it into a political body. I think that, yeah, that's the path. Thank you so much. And Miguel, same question for you, but I would also like you to, well, I would like to introduce a second topic so that you can answer both. And this has to do with a topic that is usually taboo, sexuality. In the case of the Transvestite Museum, it's extremely important. Sophia at some point asked a question that had to do with the queer machine and the notions of transvestism. But when we think of the political body and the intersection that has to do with oppression, colonial oppression, sexuality has always been there. It has crossed every realm. I mean, punishment to the body that is not the heteronormative white body, but it's the woman's body of color. So there are several conversations that we've had today that talk about this, like Vitorino, who talks about the woman flower, Dora, and sexuality that crosses the entire journey of the colonial discourse. And Cecilia Vicuña also talks about a sense of eroticism and pleasure. Venuca also talks about it in another way, another aspect of empowerment and pleasure. And in general, and Lily also mentioned how bodies are read, bodies that are uncovered, showing flesh, objectified. And Guillermo, for example, he talks about this idea of a woman's body that is a woman for desire, but also to serve. So we have this cross, like a lack of agency and violence crossing together, they're mixed. And so in the case of your presentation, Miguel, I mean, there's this entire imaginary, a decolonial imaginary to respond to this violence. So I don't know, please, the floor is yours. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and thank you to my colleagues for their presentations. I wanted to start saying that I love that Cecilia Vicuña is here and that she's here and painting. I mean, it's amazing to see her work. And to link your question to Lily's presentation, the image that Lily ended her presentation with, and the words that she used, I think are very interesting. On the one hand, she spoke about this painting not having a date or artist, so it lacks that information, and that makes me think about how there is a class and race structure and cultural bodies that historically were also the white bodies who have art associated to their productions. And on the contrary, the creative product of racialized bodies has been taken away from this category, removed from this category. It's always considered popular art, naive art, for example, and other terms that respond to that class and race and social structure. And that's how we understand cultural practice. And on the other hand, something that Lily also mentioned that is interesting is that what we have to do is, I think she used the word fiction, like invent, make up a story about that painting. And that was our responsibility, like how we come closer to that image that maybe lacks this information. And I think that that's quite interesting, and it says a lot, because in a lot of cases, the possibility of falsifying, making false or making fictional a story is the only possibility that we have, like transcribing what was stripped away from reality. And I think about that in regards to the Transvestite Museum. And this was also an exercise of invention. This was also a project where they were imagining a story that did not exist, where the trans body is at the center. It is at the center of the enunciation. And from that place, everything can be rewritten, rethought of, reconsidered, to the point that it incorporates images from this anti-colonialist person, and it's connected to the idea of the feathers with another representation. But reading a Manco Capac, like a transvestite who's covered and almost indirectly read the Inca culture as a group of transvestites, it's quite subversive, because it reorganizes the system of knowledge as we see it and understand it, and how it was organized by the Western world.
And this operation is rather potent because it is not seeking necessarily to operate under the idea of scientific truth, but rather it incorporates a speculative space. And this is, I believe, how a speculation produces truth, how the body through action produces truth, politically speaking. And this, of course, I connect with other images. I always remember these beautiful posts of these feminist artists in the 70s, where they speculated about a feminist history of music. And they have this beautiful postcard that said, Beethoven was a lesbian. And this is very, very powerful, because what they say is that to recover a feminist or trans-feminist musical history, we have to speculate on all the women composers that maybe were obliged to represent themselves as men for their work to be accepted and reproduced. And at the same time, we can think, well, maybe if Beethoven was a lesbian, in the non-written stories of women, this does mean that to be able to bring back this history, we have to push the limits of what we understand as truth or space or time as a representation. And I believe here we have a very powerful space where aesthetics, visualization, and images have a role, because they intervene in the ways with which we understand, interpret reality. And I close by saying that the project of the Transvestite Museum was not exactly a project for the world of art. It was a project that Giuseppe and her transvestite friends and created to empower the struggles of the transvestite community. It has intervened in reality, and strategically they could use the idea of art, but they could also stop using the idea of art. And I think this is very significant. Dora, I would like you to comment a little bit from your point of view, especially with the video that you produced for this conference, for you to place this idea of sexuality as an idea of violence. And you also have a collage with a series of critical texts. Some are colonial, others are not. So this would be a schizophrenic approach if the Transvestite Museum is a response to violence, creating a sort of visual imaginary community. In the case of your video, because all of these things somehow are a way of dealing with the violence of our history that continues violating in several ways. But could you please comment specifically? And also, sexuality is something that has been present in your work since the 80s in your first paintings, where you put yourself in the role of women that were murdered or raped or hit. So this has been your concern throughout this time.
Let me talk about something that is easier, which is the video. Violence is an issue in the capitalistic society. We live in a very violent world. And now in Brazil, that violence is even more explicit. It's scary. It's frightening. It's very sad to see what's going on with this current administration and the thing the current president says and believes in. I'll try to describe what I think into words, but I can do that. I can do a much better job in the video. It's a video of a collage, several texts from different authors. I admire them. They are colonial voices at times, and they are colonized voices at other times. But nonetheless, they have helped me. They have contributed, and I appropriated some images from many places, from the movies, from the arts, etc., and from literature as well. There are excerpts from literature works. All whispered texts are literary. And I try to express what I said at the beginning, that notion of multiplicity, even building the feminine, that construction is conducted by the male world, male-oriented world. The idea of feminine is determined by a masculine voice. And the notion, even the author, it can be a collective, but it's still the author. That's a reflection of that sexual organ, the male sexual organ. It's a mutilated body because men are mutilated as well. I believe that we would have to come up with a different language, and that's tough we couldn't have to resort to one single author. But the idea of multiplicity, not collective. When you say collective, it's we, it's us. Multiplicity, on the contrary, is something bigger. I think we should have to replace Oedipus with Antigonus and Ismene. We should start with parameters. That's not father and mother and having sex with the mother. We should have to rebuild sexuality and an entire society out of that. And that can only take place through violence. I'm kind of old school in that sense. Did I answer your question, Cecilia? I'm not sure.
Y podría ser contestada por otros. Pero quería preguntarle a Gabriela,
I now wanted to ask Gabriella to continue talking about sexuality from the point of view of these artists, but also taking a question from the audience, someone who said was in a very controversial conference with speaking of the queer body, and this was claimed for a definition of feminism as an approximation that becomes systematically social injustice. So, and I also have opinion in this regard, but I would like you to comment on this. Gabriela. Yes. Could you please repeat the question? This is a question says, what is the role of feminism? And they talk about this person who was in a conference where they talk about the queer body as something that could be thought of as a feminist notion. Actually, feminism can be thought of as trans feminism and many feminisms. But for me, this is a question that maybe could be answered. Maybe speaking about these artists that you presented that are defending. Well, what happens is that we have to look at all these definitions of feminism and how the genders are understood. When I discuss the case of Sarwa, I would like to review how the gender idea is being constructed in Sarwa and in the Sarwan community, to then see how these two artists, Violeta and Vinuca, try to maybe go against these notions. Sarwa is a very patriarchal community in which the way they insert these stories is from the point of view of women, and there is no discussion yet about all identities, that all other identities of gender or other sexual identities that could be discussed. I think that decolonial feminism addresses not only a reivindication of women in this binary sense, but going against a patriarchal point of view that has not allowed society to have a view on other ways of identifying in terms of gender. I don't think decolonial feminism is only about struggling against the presence or reivindication of women, but also to counteract patriarchal views that have not allowed other experiences of gender and sex to have their stories be told in the same terms. Guillermo, would you like to comment about this issue of the meeting of the violence of sexual women? Because in your presentation, you give examples in this regard. We have very few minutes.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. I do believe that modernity, the current story, is told out of violence. Men that are dominating the world. They're leaving their land to conquer the world, the land and all bodies that come before them, bodies that are different from their own. There are several authors. You mentioned my presentation. I bring Lelia Gonzalez thinking. And she thinks about that double role of the body of the Black woman. It's seen as an object of desire, but also an object to work or for work. I like to think about that because these are the types of bodies that are determined by that colonial standard imposed all the way back in the 15th century. I believe that these artists with whom I have been working, they have been providing that criticism. They have fought back against these rules, the visibility of their bodies, their struggles, their fight, thinking about the transformation of this world, trying to break away from that violence, but oftentimes some also advocate the use of violence. If it hurts us, we have to fight back. We've just heard that there's the current administration, which is a complete disgrace. Violence is everywhere, all the time. We are faced with serious food security issues, and violence is being discussed on a daily basis. So that's the basis for these papers. Living in Brazil in the middle of a pandemic in 2021 with this absolutely violent administration as far as gender is concerned, race is concerned. So we're dealing with violence all the time to look for survival strategies. And this is what many of these artists have been doing, trying to break away with that cycle of violence or to consider other life alternatives against that violence. I don't know whether I answered your question, but I tried to be as brief as I could.
Okay, well, we are finishing up, but I'd like to give the opportunity for Lily and Sebastian to answer quickly, and so that Miguel can close the session. We want to hear about the Transvestite Museum by Giuseppe Camposano. But Lily, would you like to say something quickly? Sebastian, because your presentation doesn't talk about this directly, but yeah, I was thinking, and I think I found the link. I think it's in my presentation and it works. Feminism, community feminism, which has been a space from where a vocabulary was generated to talk about the connection between earth and territory and body. And I'm thinking about Autoras de Cambio, for example, Machirish, and its theoretical work, and Lorena Capnal. And I think it has to do with this. And I don't know if we can reach multiplicity, like Dora was saying, through that path, but we could try it. What Autoras del Feminismo Comunitario talk about is body and earth, but with double meaning. First of all, like a surface of a soil that has been violated, a body that has been violated, but at the same time, the soil from which there can be a transformation and a freedom. And that freedom, as they propose, is a freedom that has to do with a defense, a very practical defense of indigenous territories, especially, but also the defense of the body, and that can lead us to a notion of body that is circular and collective. It's It is me, myself, and it is us. So I think that there's a lot of potential there, political potential even, to understand how we can transform body politics to a political body.
Gracias, Lili. Si quieres,
Thank you, Lily.
Rápido, vou fazer até
Yes, just very quickly.
Yes, I'll be brief.
no Brasil nós teremos
Next year in Brazil, we will
Next year,
have
there will be
Semana da Arte
colonial dates, the week of the modern art.
masculina,
200 years of our independence, a very masculine colonial independence, and the Black Encyclopedia is a project curated by Jaime Laureano, a Black artist, Fábio Gomes. Check our website at the Pinacoteca. I liked Miguel's project. This is a collective work of silenced biographies. We provide the reviews, 40 Black artists, men and women. They designed over 100 portraits. We have the largest portrait collection that had just a tiny fraction of Black artists and even a smaller fraction of Black subjects. So we're talking about intervention. We are going back in history. Art has never been as important, especially with this current abhorrent administration. But over to you, Miguel.
Thank you so much. I think all the interventions were fantastic. And I loved what everybody said. It was so powerful. I would just finish by saying that thinking of the project of the Transvestite Museum and how the Transvestite Museum is trying to think of a possibility of converging into new partnerships, new alliances. I mean, the idea is how to reclaim history, and a history that, how can I put this, that isn't evident or predetermined, and that doesn't fall into the idea of what a community is. The Transvestite Museum is permanently reinventing the question of how do you build a community? How do you build forms of belonging? And that's why it's always changing. I mean, we have the false museum of appropriation, and it's always changing references and images because it's trying to reinvent that way of belonging. And I think that even when Giuseppe talked about what he was doing, he didn't recognize himself as historian or curator. They saw themselves as a shaman, a spiritual healer who was trying to alter consciousness and energy of the body. So the idea of moving from museum curator to a shaman type of thing, a queer shaman, like Giuseppe used to say, he used to talk about the musex when he referred to the museum. And it's the idea of having this partnership with the transgender community and the indigenous ancestors. And I think that that's the potential that these stories and images and representations have. Thank you so much, Miguel. Now I will give the floor to Sophia. I didn't thank Sophia in the beginning for creating this moment for us, for making it possible. I know that it takes a lot of work. Thank you for the affection, and thank you, Michael, as well. Cambridge University, Lynn, and all of you. I mean, it has been fantastic to see your videos, your presentations, and I mean, I could ask 100 more questions. I believe that this political body is alive, rebellious, and it's unique, and it's somehow creating a new path. Thank you so much.
Really, I am really overwhelmed by the words that have been said, and also I really feel, we were not talking about Latin America. We weren't talking about a geography. We were talking about something that is really urgent across our discipline, across so many other disciplines, And I wish that this conversation, you know, this conversation is a conversation I feel we should have every day. So thank you for being the voices of it today. And I look forward to, these things always end too abruptly. So I look forward to seeing you soon. Please, everyone, all the audience, don't forget to watch the contributions of every member of this panel and all the other panels, which are freely available online and will remain so for the foreseeable future. And I hope to see you next week. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye. Oh, we get to stay. Okay. No.